They say our memory chooses what it keeps and what it lets go. But some memories, they don't ask. They stay. They curl up next to you like a shadow in the late afternoon and never leave. I have those. Memories that wake me in the night, that tighten my chest in the middle of the day, that won't let me forget what I lived, no matter how hard I try. Before I start, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching different places. This story I'm about to tell you, my dear, isn't like something from a soap opera. There's no heroine saved in the final scene, no villain getting what he deserves. It's real life. And real life doesn't always ask what we want. It just happens. And I endured it, quietly, for many years. But now, with time moving slower, with my grandchildren grown and my faith no longer tangled in guilt, I believe it's time to speak. Because sometimes silence screams. I was born in a tiny little place where the roads were made of packed dirt and the houses had visible bricks. The wind moved freely, and we called neighbors by name and the smell of their coffee. I was raised with prayer, cast iron pots, and obedience to authority. That obedience, now I see, was often just fear dressed up nice. We obeyed because we were told it was right, because they said that's what God wanted. I grew up surrounded by duty and expectation. My mother held her rosary like a second hand, healed wounds with herbs, and made promises to marry off her daughters to men of faith. My father was stern, a man of few words and many rules. A decent woman marries young, he'd say. And me, I dreamed. I dreamed of marrying for love, of having a little garden full of roses, of watching my children run barefoot across a swept cement floor. I dreamed of a gentle love, a good love. But what I got was something else. I remember the day he arrived, the pastor. He came from outside, no one knew from where, with a Bible under his arm and eyes that seemed to know too much. He was young, eloquent. The whole church was captivated. He spoke words that made women cry and men raise their hands. He said God had sent him, and we believed. Back then, my dear, when a man spoke of God, no one dared question him. He started visiting our home under the excuse of prayer, said he wanted to pray for my mother's health, for my father's work. But it was me he was really watching. He looked at me in a way I didn't know how to explain, a look that felt like praise and warning all at once. And me, just a girl, trembled inside. One day, after a service, he pulled me aside, said he'd had a vision, that God had shown me as his wife, that our union was divine, that I had been chosen. I couldn't breathe. I came home shaking. My mother cried with joy. My father gave thanks aloud. They said I was blessed. That few girls got that kind of gift. But I didn't feel blessed. I felt cornered. I tried to say I didn't want it, but no one listened. They said I was being ungrateful, that to reject God's choice was a grave sin, that I could bring curse on the household. And I, who barely understood life, stayed quiet. I did what was expected. I said yes, and in less than 2 months, I was married. The wedding was in the church with veil, white dress, and flowers at the altar. He smiled. I pretended. No one saw the girl shaking under the lace. No one heard the fear pounding in her chest. The party was simple, but everyone called it a happy day. Everyone, except me. The house was small, but clean, and from the first few days, I noticed his voice changed when we were far from the pulpit. He corrected me harshly, quoted scripture to justify everything. A wise woman builds her home, he'd say whenever he saw me cry. When I was quiet, it meant I was in prayer. When I questioned anything, he called it rebellion. And rebellion, he said, was the devil's work. It took me a long time to see it wasn't God speaking through him, it was just him. And over time, I died inside. I died a little the day I stopped smiling, a bit more when I stopped singing. I began to disappear. First, it was the sparkle in my eye. Then, hope. Finally, even my faith felt small. But I never stopped believing in God. What I stopped believing in were the men who used his name to control women. This is my story, my dear. One I haven't told many. Not out of shame, but because I feared no one would believe me. That they'd call me ungrateful, rebellious, heretic. They've called me all of those, you know? But now, after so many years, after holding it in for so long, I choose to tell it, because silence protects the abuser, and words free the one who survived. I remember it like it was today. It was late afternoon. the sun pouring orange light over the rooftops, children running barefoot down the dirt road, and the smell of corn cake drifting from the neighbor's kitchen. Life in our little town was like that, simple, marked by routine, Sunday church, and the whispering of old women on their porches. And into that quiet, he arrived. No one really knew where he had come from. They only said he was from a bigger city, sent by God with a mission to open a new church. He appeared in a dark suit, a leather Bible tucked under his arm, a confident smile, and the voice of someone who knew how to use words. There was a shine in his eyes and a voice that filled the small hall inside the old grocery store where the first services took place. The women in town were quickly enchanted. A man of God, handsome, young, and full of the Holy Spirit, they'd say. The men respected him, but kept their distance. My father, for one, said nothing, just scratched his chin and mumbled, "Talk's a bit too smooth for my taste." I was a young girl then, and didn't know what to think. Raised in the Catholic Church, used to quiet prayers and soft-spoken priests, that man felt like a storm. He spoke of hell and salvation with equal fire. He pointed his finger to the sky, sweated, shouted, and the people loved it. Our little town had never seen anything like it. Within a few days, his house was always full. Church ladies brought him cakes, embroidered dishcloths, helped him clean, sat for counsel. He said he was gathering the faithful to start a proper church, one with doctrine, with fasting, with truth. My mother began attending his services. She'd come back with shining eyes, saying that man was a vessel of the Lord, that we needed to open our hearts. And over time, my father gave in. One ordinary night, they told me to wear a long dress and tie up my hair. We were going to meet the pastor. I remember the way he looked at me. It was quick, but it struck me. A gaze that wasn't just pastoral. It was a look that undressed, that read me, that marked me. My face burned. I lowered my eyes, and deep inside, something told me to run. But how do you run from something everyone calls a blessing? After that service, he began coming to our house. At first, it was under the pretense of praying for my mother's aching legs. Then, to talk to my father about the scriptures, always respectful, always with that soft voice. But his eyes settled on me. I'd be washing dishes and feel him watching me. I'd be sweeping the yard and see him standing there, speaking to my father. But his eyes were on me, and every time he came, it was like a weight entered the house. My stomach hurt, my soul shrank, but my mother smiled. She'd say, "This pastor will bring many blessings to this home." It didn't take long for him to ask for a word with me. He called my parents together and said he had received a revelation, that God had shown him in a dream that I was his chosen wife, that together we would build a great ministry. My parents were moved, my mother cried, my father gripped his hand with pride, and me, I stayed silent, because no one asked what I felt. No one cared whether my heart wanted that marriage. They said it was God's will, and against that, who could speak? That was how he came, like a storm dressed as a pastor, a man who wore faith like a cloak. And I, a girl in long skirts and swallowed silence, was swept away by the wind. And so began what I did not yet know would become my prison. After the pastor said he'd received a revelation from God about our marriage, my life became something else. It wasn't joy that arrived. It was a heavy waiting. It was as if everyone had already decided for me, and I was only there to nod in agreement. In those days, my house became a parade of churchwomen. Some came to give me advice, others came to measure the length of my skirts, and some just stared and smiled like they already knew how the story would end. It was as if I had been given a role in a play, and no one bothered to ask if I wanted to act. The decision was made. I was the chosen one. My mother, she walked around the house with a glow in her eyes, almost like she had won a prize. She told everyone her daughter was going to marry a man of God, that I would be the first lady of the altar. With every visit, every service, she reminded me, "You've been set apart, my daughter. God chose you." And the more she said that, the smaller my heart felt. My father was quieter, never affectionate, but also never one to ask what I felt. One afternoon, after lunch, he called me out back. I thought maybe he'd listen, that I could say I wasn't ready, that I was scared. But he just looked at me and said, "Be a proper woman. God knows what he's doing." I swallowed hard, and the little bit of courage I had melted right there between the guava tree and the clothesline. At church, the air was festive. The pastor preached with more fire. He spoke of marriage, of obedience, of how a wise woman sustains her husband's ministry. The sisters looked at me with admiration, some even with envy. They said I was lucky, that every girl dreamed of this, but I didn't dream. I woke up sweating, chest tight, crying without knowing why. I started losing sleep. Sometimes I'd look at my bed and feel afraid of what was coming, afraid to lie beside a man I barely knew, who looked at me like one picks fruit in the market for the pretty skin and the promise of sweetness. One day, I asked my mother if we could wait a little longer. I told her I wanted to study, maybe help at Mr. Joachim's shop. She widened her eyes as if I'd said a sin. And disobey God's will? Do you want to shame this house? After that, I never asked again. The preparations began. Someone donated fabric for the dress. A sister said she'd sew it. They prayed over me, anointed my hands with oil, said I was being purified to be the wife of a holy man. But holy he didn't seem. The way he looked at me, the way he touched my arm when no one was looking, it wasn't purity. It was ownership. It was control. I felt it, but I thought maybe it was all in my head. After all, he was anointed, and who was I to doubt? Sometimes I wanted to disappear, run without direction, sleep for years, but there was nowhere to go. A decent girl didn't run. A girl of faith obeyed. That's what they told me. That's what they demanded. On the Sunday before the wedding, the church held an all-night vigil just to pray for us. They had me kneel at the front of the altar. He placed his hands on my head and prayed loudly. Everyone cried. I just felt empty. In that moment, I realized no one was going to save me. Not my mother, not my father, not the sisters from church, not even God. At least not the God they preached, because that God seemed more worried about appearances than about the hearts of his daughters. And so, with a heavy soul and a white dress being sewn in a hurry, I accepted what I did not want. Not out of faith, out of fear of disobedience, fear of condemnation, fear of being called rebellious, possessed, a woman without submission. The church pressured me with blessings. My family pressured me with silence, and I gave in. One step at a time, one tear each night, one yes that took a piece of me, day after day. I got married on a hot spring morning. The sky was clear, the birds were making a fuss in the mango tree in our yard, and my mother was smiling more than I'd ever seen. They dressed me in a simple white gown, sewn by the hands of churchwomen, with donated fabric and stitched-in hopes. In the mirror, I looked like a bride. Inside, I was all fear. The church was full. People from all around came to witness God's promise being fulfilled. The pastor, him, smiled like someone who had already won. He climbed the altar with a Bible tucked under his arm and that shine in his eyes that fooled so many. I was trembling. My hands were sweating. My heart wanted to leap out of my chest, and inside me, a small voice screamed, "This isn't what you want." But I stayed silent. I did what was expected. I said yes with my lips, while my whole body said no. And that's how my marriage began. Right after the ceremony, we went straight to the house that would be ours. There was no celebration. He said parties were vanity, of the world. Everything had to be sober, holy, controlled, and he controlled everything, from the way I tied my hair to how I placed the plates on the table. At first, he was sweet, not out of love, but because he knew how to manipulate. He knew when to speak softly, how to act concerned about my meals, how to ask if I was tired. But it only took a week for his tone to change. Then came the commands, the harsh eyes, the sermons inside our home. Everything I did was corrected. I was no longer a daughter, not even a wife. I was a servant. He said I was lucky. That many women in the church would give anything to be in my place, that I had the privilege of serving a man chosen by God. And if I cried, it was the devil trying to confuse me. If I disagreed, I was rebellious. If I stayed silent, I lacked prayer. I started to feel like a piece of furniture. I was there, but voiceless. I only moved when told. I went to bed tense, woke up nauseated. He laid beside me like someone completing a duty, never looking me in the eye. Sometimes he'd pray aloud right after, as if cleansing sin with words. And I shrank a little more each day. At church, he was someone else entirely. Spoke with tenderness, smiled at the sisters, gave marriage advice to couples. No one imagined what happened once the door shut, and I never told. Because who would believe me? Who would listen to the pastor's wife say she lived in a prison? I blamed myself, thought I was weak, that I wasn't good enough, that if I read the Bible more, prayed harder, fasted with more intensity, he would change. But he didn't change, and I faded. First my voice, then my dreams. I remember one night clearly. I had cried quietly in the bathroom so no one would hear. When I came out, he was sitting in the chair with the Bible open. He looked at me coldly and said, "A foolish woman tears her house down with her own hands," then went back to reading like nothing had happened. That night, I went to sleep with a sick soul, and that's how it went. One day more confined than the last, every movement watched, every word measured, and the worst of it, applause from the church and silence from my family. They all said I was married to a man of God. And I, trapped in what they called a blessing, lived a life whose weight only I knew. It wasn't marriage, it was captivity in white lace, and I only began to understand that many years later. The first night I spent beside him was unlike anything I had imagined about marriage. There was no romance, no affection, no soft words. There was loud prayer and a thick silence, a silence that cut through me, that swallowed the voice of my soul. We arrived at the house late that night. He opened the door and gestured for me to step inside first. There were no flowers, no new sheets, no detail to mark the beginning of a new life. He dropped his Bible on the table and took off his jacket without looking at me. He went straight to the bedroom, a simple room with an old iron bed, a hard mattress, white sheets pressed by some kind sister from church. I followed, not knowing where to put my shoes, my hands, or my fear. The room was plain, with a wooden cross hanging above the bed. But what weighed me down wasn't the crucifix. It was the silence. He knelt by the bed and began to pray, loudly, with strong words, as if casting out a demon. He prayed for purity, for self-control, for God to tame the heart of his wife. And I, kneeling beside him, not knowing what to say, simply curled in on myself, holding back tears. When he finished, he stood up and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't tenderness, it was duty. He lay down, turned his back, and blew out the lamp. I stayed there, awake, listening to the crickets and night sounds drifting through the window. Inside me, everything collapsed. Outside, silence. The second night was different. He approached me, placed his hand on my shoulder, and said I was his property now, that my body belonged to his ministry, that it was holy marital duty. He spoke like giving a command, not sharing love, and I, with no place to hide my soul, just obeyed. I closed my eyes and left my body there, waiting for it to be over. It didn't only hurt physically, it hurt my faith. It hurt what I believed love was. Afterward, he turned to sleep like nothing had happened. I cried in silence, a mute cry, buried in the pillow, ashamed even for God to hear me. In the following days, everything repeated. He prayed beforehand, did as he pleased, and turned over to sleep. He never asked if I was all right, if it hurt, if I was scared. He never looked me in the eye. I was just a body. And the cruelest part, I thought it was normal. Because no one had told me what it was to be a woman inside a marriage. They had only taught me to obey, to serve, to accept, to endure in the name of faith. And that's what I did. For weeks, months, maybe years. The pain became routine. The fear became habit. I remember a night I woke up soaked in sweat, my heart pounding. A nightmare, perhaps. I got up and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. When I returned, he was waiting for me with the Bible open. He said a woman who flees her husband's bed is in sin. I simply lowered my head and crawled back under the covers. How many times I wished to be heard. But who hears the pastor's wife? Who listens to a cry that won't leave the throat? Who sees the pain behind a polite smile at Sunday service? In that house, my body was captive, and my voice buried. But I pretended. I pretended for my mother when she came to visit. I pretended for the church sisters. I pretended for myself every morning when I woke up, and each time he touched me without love, I died a little more inside. It was there, in that dark room, beneath that hanging cross, that I learned to smile without joy, to keep quiet while my soul screamed, to be a wife on paper and a prisoner in truth, and all of it with the church's blessing, Faith had always been a shelter for me. Since I was a little girl, I was taught to pray before sleep, to kneel down on hard days, to look up at the sky for answers. My mother used to say that God sees everything, even what we hide from our own hearts. And I believed that with the innocence of someone who only knew goodness. But inside that marriage, faith became something else. It was no longer comfort, nor refuge. It became a rope around my neck, a burden, a means of control. He used the Bible like someone wielding a whip. Every sacred word that left his mouth came like a sentence, not to guide, but to dominate. And I, with my mind tightly wrapped in doctrine, received every verse as if it were a divine order. Everything turned into sin. If I delayed serving the plate, it was rebellion. If I stared out the window too long, it was vanity. If I grew tired and laid down in the afternoon, it was laziness of the flesh. And he always had a passage ready to justify it all. A wise woman builds her house, but the foolish tears it down with her own hands. A wife should submit to her husband as unto the Lord. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. I heard it all in silence, and each phrase was a new wound, not on the body, but on the soul, because he used the word to shrink me, to make me small, to make me believe that pain was holy and suffering sacred. And for a time, I believed it. I began to think God was shaping me through suffering, that I had to endure it to become purer, more worthy, stronger. When he said I was weak, I fasted. When he said my spirit was contaminated, I prayed through the night. I cried on my knees, asking forgiveness for sins I couldn't even name. It was as if my faith had been hijacked. He said my mission was to obey, that I had to be a suitable helper, that if I complained, it was murmuring. And murmuring, he said, attracts curses. He always reminded me of Job's wife, as if I had to swallow everything in silence to be holy. And if I dared to raise my voice, he compared me to Jezebel, as if I was being used by the devil just for disagreeing. I no longer knew what was right or wrong, because he blended everything together: doctrine, scripture, punishment, love, and fear. And the worst part? The church said, Amen. Out there, in the pulpit, he was a man admired. People were moved by his preaching. They said he was pure fire, full of spiritual authority. And me? I sat in the front pew, with a long dress and downcast eyes, pretending to be the blessed wife, the wife full of faith. But inside, my faith was bleeding. I remember one service in particular where he preached about marital obedience. He said, before everyone, that God punishes the disobedient wife, that many women were losing their blessings for not submitting. He said it while looking directly at me, as if the sermon had a name and address. The sisters shouted, Amen. Some even cried. And I wanted to vanish, to disappear among those chairs, to run to my mother and say I couldn't take it anymore. But I didn't run, because he always said that a woman who abandons her home brings shame to the gospel. And because I was afraid to leave and be called rebellious, afraid God would punish me for not enduring. Little by little, I began to feel ashamed of my faith, not of God, but of how his name was being used to keep me captive, used to justify abuse, used to silence my soul. That's when I realized this wasn't faith, it was captivity dressed up as spirituality. And the key to my prison was in the hands of someone who wielded the Bible as a weapon. I used to think it was just me, that only I carried that silent pain in my chest, only I woke up with that tightness in my stomach, only I cried in silence so that not even God would hear me. But one day, I began to notice the eyes of other women, not the kind of eyes that shine with love, the other kind, hollow, dry eyes, like someone who's grown tired of screaming on the inside. I saw them during the church service, when he preached in that strong voice, talking about holiness, submission, and obedience. I looked at the women sitting in the pews and saw it. Some weren't moved, they were shrinking. One of them was Sister Maristela, a young widow. She lived with her 2 little daughters. She was one of the most devoted in the church, always in a long dress, headscarf, eyes downcast. One day, I brought her a cake, at my mother-in-law's request. When I arrived, she took a while to open the door. And when she did, I saw something wasn't right. It wasn't a bruise. It was the way she shrank, the way she hid her face, like even the sunlight frightened her. I entered, sat down, tried to make conversation, and between one quiet sentence and another, she said, softly, almost in a whisper, "What he does to you. He tries to do to others too. I didn't know how to respond. She looked down, took a breath, and continued. He came here, said he wanted to pray with me, that God had a purpose. He spoke beautifully, and then pushed me against the wall, said my body needed purification, that I should serve the anointed. My skin went cold. That feeling I'd had from his stare, that thing that made me want to run even before we married. It wasn't just in my head. It was real, and it wasn't only happening to me. I left her house with the cake forgotten, my stomach churning, and a deep urge to scream. But scream to who? He was the pastor, the leader, the chosen vessel. And she? A woman alone, no husband, no voice. Who would believe her? Worse, who would believe me? After that day, I started watching more closely. During services, prayer meetings, home visits, I saw how he lingered near young girls, how he spent too long in the homes of women who lived alone, how his words were soft, but his eyes burned. One Sunday, in the church kitchen, while we were cleaning up after lunch, a sister named Estefania, new to the congregation, dropped a dish. When I bent down to help, she whispered, "He tried to pray with me behind a closed door, but I didn't let him." I looked into her eyes. I saw the same hidden fear, the same doubt, the same guilt, because he made it seem like it was our fault, that it was our body, our scent, our presence, and we believed him. Faith had become a minefield for women. Any misstep was sin. Any no could become an accusation. And worst of all, among us, very few spoke, out of fear, out of shame, or because they thought it was only happening to them. I began to write in a hidden notebook. I wrote down what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. It was the only way I knew how to stay sane. But each page I wrote was also a risk. If he found it, he could say I was possessed, rebellious, a liar. Still, I kept writing, because I realized pain only grows in the dark. And if others were hurting like I was, then I wasn't alone. And if I wasn't alone, maybe one day we could find a way out. That was the first time I felt, even just a little, something like courage. It did not happen overnight. It was slow, so slow that by the time I realized, I no longer recognized myself in the mirror. The pain did not arrive shouting. It came like a silent visitor, entering through the back door and settling in the chest without asking. I woke up tired, as if I had not slept. My whole body ached, even without effort. Sometimes, it felt like my heart was a stone and my soul, a dark room where no one entered anymore. I dragged myself through the days as if carrying an invisible burden. No one saw it, but I felt it. My face, once alive, began to fade. My eyes lost their shine. My hair fell more than usual, and my voice, oh, my voice seemed to hide inside me. I no longer spoke much, and when I did, it was softly, as if afraid to be heard. At first, I thought it was just fatigue. After all, the routine was heavy. Home, church, duties. But deep down, I knew. It was not the body. It was the soul. It was the weight of living with a man who used me in the name of God, who silenced me with verses and wounded me with prayers. And when I tried to talk about it with one of the elder sisters of the church, she said it was a spiritual battle, that I needed to pray more, fast more, sanctify myself, that it was the enemy trying to pull me away from God's presence. That hurt, because I was already losing myself, and no one saw it. I started having crying fits without reason. I would sit for hours, staring at nothing. Sometimes I forgot to eat. Sometimes I ate too much. Time passed without meaning. All the days were the same. And the nights were far too long. I remember one night, I thought I was going to die. My heart raced. I could not breathe. I thought it was a heart attack, but it was something else. It was despair. It was anxiety. It was my soul screaming for help and my body trying to warn me. I ended up at Sister Aparecida's house. She made me tea, prayed with me, but also looked at me differently. A look of someone who knew. Someone who perhaps had been through it too. It was the first time someone did not just tell me to pray more. She listened. And even without saying much, just the fact that she listened brought me a thread of relief. But he, my husband, he said I was weak in faith, that a woman who feels sadness is living in sin, that the joy of the Lord is our strength, and that if I was not joyful, it meant I had drifted away from God. I cried so much after that, cried like a child, because I loved God. I always had. I just no longer knew how to bear it all. My body started reacting. Constant headaches, dizziness, nausea. My menstrual cycle became irregular, my skin pale, my eyes hollow. Even so, I went to church, sat in the front row, gave a soft smile, answered, "Amen," because that was what they expected of me. Inside, I just wanted to disappear. I began to avoid mirrors, to fear the mornings, to ask God to take me, but without anyone knowing. I prayed in silence. "Lord, if it is a sin to want to leave, forgive me, but take me. Take me without scandal, without pain for others. Just take me." But God did not take me, and that was both salvation and punishment, because I stayed, and because I stayed, I had to face it. I had to admit that my pain was not just spiritual. It was real. It was lived, and fasting alone would not fix it. I needed to be heard. I needed to be cared for. But who cares for a pastor's wife? For a long time, I was sick inside, and the saddest part was that sickness became part of me, as if that pain was the price of being the wife of a man of God. Only later, when I had the courage to truly speak, did I realize it was not weakness, it was abuse, and it was not God's will. It was too much silence, silence that killed me a little more every day. It was a heavy January afternoon. The sky was white, with no sun and no rain, and the air pressed down on our skin. I was in the kitchen, stirring beans over the wood stove, sweating in silence. The heat outside was almost the same as the heat within, the kind that boils inside when your soul is tired. That's when I heard knocks at the front door. It was not a usual time for visits. My heart skipped, that kind of skip we feel when something unexpected arrives. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the front room. When I opened the door, I was hit with a good kind of shock. It was Aunt Lourdes, my mother's sister. She had lived in another town for many years. She did not send word she was coming, and so it felt like fresh air entering a stifled house. "My child," she said, opening her arms, eyes already wet. We hugged right there on the doorstep. She held me like someone who knows the other is falling apart inside, and I, who no longer remembered what it felt like to be embraced, cried. I cried softly on her shoulder, like someone who has finally found a safe place. We came in. I made fresh coffee, served it with old cake, but she did not mind. She looked at me with a kind of attention I had not seen in a long time. She did not ask much at first, but her eyes told me she already knew. Only after the second cup did she speak, her voice gentle. "Your mother wrote me, said she's worried about you, said you don't speak like you used to, that you've grown thin, that you always seem sad." I looked down. There was no way to deny it. She waited, and I let go. I spoke like someone breaking a dam. I told her about the silences, the punishments disguised as prayer, the nights I begged God to make me disappear. I spoke without fear, because she was my aunt. But at that moment, she was like a mother. She listened fully, did not interrupt, did not tell me to pray more, did not say it was a spiritual battle. She simply took my hand and said, "This is not life. This is not from God. This is a prison." I trembled, because no one had ever said that out loud. No one had ever named my pain. A prison. That was what it was. And I was a prisoner who had learned to smile with shackles. We talked late into the night. For the first time, I told everything, and I did not feel guilty. For the first time, someone looked at me without judgment, and in that gaze, there was a glimmer of hope. The next morning, she took me into town, said we were going to visit a doctor. On the way, my heart tightened. What if he found out? What if someone saw us? But I went, because a part of me wanted to live, wanted to understand why it hurt so much. The doctor heard my story. He examined me, asked questions, looked at me with respect, and in the end he said firmly, "What you are feeling has a name. It is depression. It is trauma. You are sick from the pain you've lived through." I cried like someone who learns pain has a name, and if it has a name, it can have a cure. Aunt Lourdes embraced me, said she would help, that I was not alone, that true faith sets us free. It does not imprison. That visit changed everything. Because it was there, I began to understand that God did not want my suffering, that He saw me, that He loved me, and that to live was more than just to endure. Change, when it begins, is subtle. It's like a crack in silence, First comes the courage to think differently. Then, the boldness to whisper what once lived only in thought. And before we know it, the body no longer accepts pain as routine. After Aunt Lourdes's visit, something lit up inside me. It wasn't a revolution overnight. It was a process, a slow awakening. I started to ask myself in a quiet voice why I obeyed so much, why my faith hurt me, why I feared a man who claimed to represent God. At first, he didn't notice. He went on with his sermons at home, his commands dressed up as doctrine. But I began to respond differently. I no longer lowered my head so quickly. I began to look him in the eyes, a simple act, but one that shook his world. "What kind of look is that?" he asked one late afternoon. "A whole look," I replied. It was the first time I saw his face lose its firmness. He wasn't used to resistance, even in such a small form. I kept changing, slowly but firmly. I began sleeping in another room, said I needed silence to pray. He laughed, mocked me, but allowed it. I knew it wouldn't last forever, but it was a beginning. I returned to writing in my notebook. I wrote down everything, my pains, my prayers, my doubts. And there, in those hidden pages, I began building the courage to exist. With each sentence, I remembered that I was a person, not just a wife, not just a helper. I was a woman, with a soul, with desires, with rights. He began to notice, first in silence, then with harsh questions. "What rebellion is this? What spirit is influencing you? Who's poisoning your ears against me?" I answered little, not out of fear, but to conserve. My words had become too precious to waste on ears that had never wanted to listen. Little by little, the house changed its scent. The fear that had lived in the corners began to lift. I opened windows, let the sunlight in, planted herbs on the porch, small acts that, to me, meant freedom. Of course, he disliked it, said I was growing cold in the faith, that I had stepped out from under his spiritual covering, but I knew it wasn't coldness. It was rescue of myself. And then came the day he tried to pray with me, as he used to, loud, full of authority. But I gently held his hand and said, "I pray alone now." That sentence dropped like a stone to the floor. He looked at me as if staring into an abyss, and I, for the first time, felt no guilt. I felt peace. That was the day he realized I was changing, that the submissive, silent, faded woman was disappearing, and in her place, a woman was being born who would no longer confuse faith with captivity. He tried to break me with fasting, with threats of curses, with fiery speeches, but the more he tried, the stronger I became, because I now knew God does not dwell in fear. God dwells in love, and love does not make us sick. The first time I truly thought about leaving was on a Thursday morning. The sky was overcast, and the wind carried a sadness that seemed to come from inside me. I stood at the kitchen window, a dish towel in my hands, my eyes lost in the distance. My body was there, but my soul had already begun packing its bags. It wasn't because of one specific argument. It wasn't a sudden outburst. It was accumulation, the sum of all the words that wounded me, all the silences that swallowed me whole. I was tired of surviving. I remember taking a deep breath, as if searching for courage deep in my lungs. I went to the bedroom, opened the old blue suitcase from under the bed, and began placing a few clothes inside. Nothing too much, just enough to leave. A change of clothes, a few coins I had hidden in a sewing box, and the notebook where I wrote my thoughts. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to get out of there, even if only to come back later. I just wanted to breathe different air. But then I heard the front door open. He had come back earlier than usual. My body froze. I slid the suitcase back under the bed and sat down as if nothing had happened. He came in, looked around and asked, "Everything all right?" I answered with a quiet yes that barely left my lips. He looked at me with suspicion but didn't press. Still, I trembled inside for the rest of the day. And right there, I discovered that leaving wouldn't be easy. Not with him inside the house, not with all the layers of control he had built around me. In the days that followed, I started planning my escape more carefully. I rehearsed in my mind the times, the routes, the excuses. But every time I practiced, a fear came that paralyzed me. What if he found out? What if he reacted? What if he accused me in church, said I was possessed, rebellious, lost? More than the fear of him, it was the fear of guilt, the guilt he had planted in me for so many years, the idea that leaving would be sin, that I would be disobeying God, that abandoning my home was a curse. All of it echoed in my mind like voices from the past. That's when I started writing letters I never sent. I wrote as if I were telling my story to someone out there, someone who would believe me. It was my way of leaving in thought, of freeing what was still trapped inside. One of those letters I wrote to myself. It said, "You have the right to leave. You have the right to choose to live. God does not want your death in life. God wants you whole, alive, breathing in peace." I read and reread those words many times until I began to believe in them, even just a little. That first attempt to leave failed, but something changed inside me. Because courage, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. It might hide for a while, but it returns. It always returns. And I knew, one day, I wouldn't just think of leaving, I would leave. Courage, my child, does not come for free. It costs. It costs more than we can imagine. It costs the sideways glances, the broken words, the hugs that never came back. I learned that when I began to speak. It was after that first attempt to leave. I could not get out, but something inside me did. Out went the fear of thinking. Out went the fear of questioning. And slowly, the fear of speaking began to slip away too. At church, I started paying attention to the other women. Their restless hands, their trembling smiles, their swallowed words. I knew what it meant. I had lived like that too. And that's when I decided I had to do more than just survive. I began to draw close to some, through short conversations, long glances, everything very discreet, because in that place, saying too much could be dangerous. But I could feel they understood. Some even replied with tears, without speaking a word. Then one day, one of them came to me, Sister Estela, young, beautiful, newly married to a man in my husband's inner circle. She pulled me aside after service and said, "I need to talk, but I'm afraid." I held her hand and said, "So was I." We met days later, hidden in a neighbor's house. She spoke, and I listened. I heard a story of abuse, of control, of fear. It was like hearing my own life told in another voice. In the end, she cried and asked, "What now? What do I do?" And I, not really knowing, answered from the heart, "You are not alone." That phrase became my mission, because I realized what hurt us most was the loneliness, the certainty that no one would believe us, that we'd be called rebellious, possessed. So even in fear, I started to speak, first through notes, then through discreet gatherings. There were few of us, but each woman who heard me gave me strength. It was as if my pain was no longer mine alone. But then came the price. The gossip began. They said I was growing cold in the faith, that I was a bad influence on the sisters. A church leader pulled me aside and said, "A woman who disrespects her husband dishonors God." Some sisters began to avoid me. Others just stayed quiet, and those who needed help the most pulled away, afraid of being seen with me. I understood. I did not blame them, because fear, my child, is a wild beast, and when it bites, we do everything we can to stay unnoticed. Still, I kept going, because I knew, if even one woman found strength in my words, it was worth it. If even one understood that God does not want fearful servants, but free daughters, it would already be a miracle. But courage, oh courage, cost me dearly. I lost friends. I lost place. I even lost the right to sing in the choir. But I gained something no doctrine could take away, the certainty that my voice mattered. And one day I saw in another woman's eyes, Sister Rita, that same light that once returned to mine. And then I knew, when one woman speaks, she opens a path for others to speak too. But the price is the silence of those who still cannot, and we honor that silence by speaking. Shame, my child, does not always come from what we do, but from what others try to do to us in front of a crowd. And it was on a Sunday during a packed service, with the church full, that he tried to silence me, not just with words, but with humiliation. The morning had already started off strange. He woke up quieter than usual, with his brow furrowed and his eyes heavy. While I set the breakfast table, he looked at me like someone holding something stuck in his throat. And he was. I knew it. I had been acting differently for weeks, refusing orders that made no sense, questioning commands that only served to trap me. He was bothered. I could see it. We arrived at the church, and I went straight to my usual seat, on the right side, near the window. He climbed to the pulpit with that firm voice, upright posture, and started preaching about obedience, about submissive women, about the danger of rebellion inside the home. Up until then, I expected it. That was his way of sending veiled messages. But then, in the middle of the sermon, he paused, fell silent for a moment, looked straight at me, and said, "There are women, even in this house of God, who rise against the spiritual authority of their husbands, who try to teach other sisters to rebel. That is the spirit of Jezebel. That is the devil disguised as false piety." His words hit the church floor like stones. Everyone glanced at each other. Some looked at me, others pretended not to. In that moment, I felt a deafening silence inside me. Blood rushed to my face, my hands trembled, but I did not cry. I would not give him the pleasure. He went on speaking, spitting verses, raising his voice, said he would pray right there to cast out that spirit, and he called everyone to pray with him. For me, I closed my eyes, but it was not to pray with him. It was to shield myself. Inside, I whispered, "God, cover me. Do not let this shame crush me. Give me strength to keep my head up." When I opened my eyes, I saw a few sisters approaching, their heads lowered without conviction. Others stayed in their seats, uncomfortable. And then, something unexpected happened. Sister Rita, the same one who once looked at me with courage, stood up and said aloud, "Pastor, with all respect, the sister never taught me rebellion. She taught me how to live without fear. If that is a sin, then we are all in sin." The silence that followed was louder than any shout. He lost his footing, tried to deflect, changed his tone, ended the prayer quickly, and left the pulpit. That day, I was exposed, but I did not feel humiliated, because for the first time, someone spoke with me, not against me, in front of everyone. And there, I understood something. When we stand, those who want to silence us lose power, because truth, my child, can be suppressed, but never defeated. Some nights do not end just because the sun rises. Some nights stay inside us for days, months, years. And that night, that was the last I spent under the same roof as him. But it still lives in me, as memory and as deliverance. The afternoon had been quiet, more than usual. He did not speak to me all day, and when he did, it was with his eyes. A hard look, one that held anger, one that tried to control through fear. I felt something was coming. The air was heavy. The walls felt narrow. At dinner, we ate in silence. I barely chewed, my stomach in knots. I tried to leave the table early, but he called me back with a sharp sit, almost a shout. I sat, my plate still in front of me. He rested his elbows on the table, clasped his hands, and said, "Either you silence yourself or you leave." That was it. No riddles, no veiled verses. For the first time, he spoke plainly. He gave me the choice that deep down he had already made for me, to be quiet or to go. I looked him in the eyes and answered, "Then it's decided. I will leave." He laughed, a dry, mocking laugh. "Leave to where? Who will take you in? So many lies have already been told about you. Who will believe you?" That question hurt, but it did not break me. Because I had already chosen, between living voiceless or starting over in fear, I would choose to start over. That night, I went to my room and did not sleep. I spent hours packing my bag. There was little, but it felt like much. Each piece of clothing had a story. Each object seemed to ask if I was really going to leave it behind. But I knew. This was not escape. It was liberation. The night was long. The clock ticked too loud. The whole house seemed to know it was my goodbye. The floor creaked differently. The wind moaned like lament. Around 4 in the morning, I put on a simple dress, slipped on the shoes that held me best, grabbed my suitcase, and walked down the stairs slowly. The porch light was on. He was there, sitting, waiting for me. He said nothing, nor did I. We just looked at each other. And in that look, there was an end. The end of fear, the end of waiting, the end of an era. I opened the gate with steady hands. I did not look back. And when my feet touched the dirt road, I felt, for the first time in many years, that I was the owner of my path. That was the last night in that house, and the first of my freedom. Those first days away from him were like learning to breathe again. The air was different. The silence of the new house did not frighten me. It was rest. The solitude was not punishment. It was freedom. And little by little, I realized that despite everything, I was still alive. Hurt, yes, but alive. I stayed at Aunt Lourdes' house for a while. She took me in like a mother, with care and no hurry. Let me sleep late, let me cry without asking why, gave me tea, blankets, and silence. And in that silence, I began to hear myself for the first time. I walked slowly through the house, through the streets, looked at the trees, the walls, the faces of people. Everything seemed new. I no longer carried that weight in my chest. My body still ached, the ache of the soul, but I was no longer afraid to exist. Aunt Lourdes took me to a women's group in the community, women who had also lived through hard stories. There, I heard many voices that echoed mine, but I also heard laughter, plans, dreams, and in one of those meetings, one of them, Mrs. Zuleika, looked at me with kindness and said, "You still have so much ahead of you. God has not finished your story." That stayed in my mind, because until then, I thought my life was already closed, that my time had passed, that I was only surviving. But slowly, that little seed began to grow. I started writing again, not just venting, but dreaming, wishing, simple things, to sing again, to visit my sister, to plant roses in front of the house, and one day, to love without fear. That's when I realized it was still time to live, that my story had not ended in that house, that life is not measured by how old we are, but by the courage to start again. I took a sewing class, began helping at the neighborhood fair, made friends with neighbors. One of them even invited me to a senior ladies' dance. I laughed, said I did not know how to dance anymore. But I went, and I danced. With timid feet, but a light heart, I discovered that living did not mean forgetting what happened. It meant remembering, without hurting. It meant looking at the past and saying, I survived. And in that process, I understood that my time still existed, that there were still mornings to be born, that God, the real one, did not want my blind obedience. He wanted my life, and I was, finally, beginning to live it. Sometimes people ask if I regret it. If I could go back in time, would I do things differently? And well, I think about it. How could I not? We carry scars that itch when the weather changes. We remember, but regret, no. If I could go back, I would still speak. I would speak even knowing I'd lose friends, even knowing I'd be humiliated, that I'd walk alone, be judged. I would still speak because my voice was the beginning of my freedom. And there is no peace without truth. I spent years living in silence, swallowing tears, tightening my throat, and when my voice finally came out, it was weak, trembling, but it was mine, and with it, I began to untie the knots. There were days I wanted to give up. Nights I cried in silence, asking God if all this would be worth it. And you know what I felt? I felt that He heard me, that He wanted me alive, not obedient to a man who used His name to destroy me. Now, with time behind me, I see things more clearly. I see that the girl who dreamed of pure love became a silenced woman, but then became a woman who shouts, who writes, who plants, who dances, who helps others speak too. There was pain, yes, there was loss, but there was healing. There was life after pain. There was morning after night. And if I could go back there, back to the first time he raised his voice, the first humiliation, the first lie, maybe I wouldn't have had the strength to leave, because I was young. I was naive. But today I would go back just to say to that girl, you will leave this, you will live, and you will tell your story. Because telling is also healing. It is also freeing, not just for me, but for those who listen. If I could go back, I would still speak, and I would speak louder. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.